Many of you know a lot about the Bible. Some of you may not know much about the Bible, but in most of our society, the Bible is viewed as a collection of anthologies and stories and sometimes myths. But the approach that the Bible takes and the writers of the Bible is a totally different approach. It's an approach that says that this is a communication that was given by God. I can't prove that. You can't prove that it is or that it isn't. But it's stated that it's a communication under the inspiration of God because God loved us so much. He wanted us to know what life would be like on this earth and how our lives could be better on this earth. And so we've been looking at some of the foundations that God has put together for society. And we call it Foundations Revisited, going back to the book of Genesis, and what the basis of a healthy society would be. We talked about looking to life in the midst of death from Genesis chapter 3, verses 20 through 4:2. And we said that Adam did that in the past weeks in the terms of how God rescued Adam, and also Eve in looking to having children. The concept of a creation responsible to Creator is the only true foundation, we said, for personal, national, global health and security in our world, because we live in a very insecure world. I mean, we're on the verge of one nation invading other nations, and everyone is on edge at times. And so it helps us to go back to this. Now, part of the problem is, as people turned away from God, disregard, murder, violence, and further breakdown of society took place. And we see that in Genesis chapter 4. There had never been such a thing as a murder. There had never been such a thing as violence up until this story in Genesis chapter 4 with the story of Cain and Abel. But the hope in all of it is that Eve looks at life by faith in the birth of her first child. This is what Genesis 4 says. We looked at it last week. Genesis 4:1, Adam made love to his wife, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. She said, with the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man. Later she gave birth to his son Abel. So her hope was in the fact that there was procreation, that the population would go on, that there would be families, there would be family units, there would be society. However, mankind's disregard, murder, and violence furthered the breakdown of society, and we experience that breakdown even today. We said that our world is broken, it's fallen, and God is in the process of repairing us, but He does that through the redemption of our Lord Jesus Christ. Now, Abel, it says in Genesis, kept flocks. He was a herder. And Cain worked the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. And Abel also brought an offering. So these were the two brothers from Eve. There will be other sons and daughters as a result. Fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering He did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry, and his face was downcast. Now you might say, well, wait a minute. Did God establish a rule? Did God say, this is the way you come to me? I mean, we have the mentality in our culture that says, you know what, I can worship God on my terms at any time I want, in any way I want. If I want to go up to a mountaintop, we decide we're going to write the rules. And I've used this illustration before. It's kind of like your child going out and joining the basketball team. And he goes out and he's going to play basketball, on a Saturday morning with the rest of the team, only he brings a football out. And they say to him, well, what are you doing? Well, I'm playing basketball. Well, not with a football, you're not. And he begins to bounce the football, he begins to kick the football, and everybody looks at him kind of oddly and says, what's going on? That's not how you play basketball. There are certain rules for playing basketball. There are certain rules for driving a car. There are certain principles that make things happen. And yet in religion, in spirituality, we have the concept that, I can make up the rules any way I want. That God doesn't really set the rules, that God doesn't have any say or any parameters. And so our society goes off and pretends or thinks that it's worshiping God in ways that just are not according to God's pattern. It's like playing basketball with a football, and it just doesn't work. Different rules to the game. So what happened with Cain is Abel kept the flocks, Cain worked the soil. Cain decided, I am going to bring the offering that I want, but God had stipulated that this was not a soil offering, this was an animal offering. And the Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. And so the result was, when we decide to play by our own rules, it affects our society. It affects the way we do things, and affects the way we feel about each other. And I want you to see this. As far as I know, in the Old Testament, this was the first evidence of depression. So Cain was very angry, and his anger caused depression. Now, there are a lot of other things that cause depression. There's a whole psychological area. There are many, many factors that do that. But this is one of the things that happened. His face was downcast. In the Hebrew, that's another word for being disappointed, being depressed, being anxious, and being angry. And part of it was because he was trying to go against God's way of doing things. The Bible Knowledge Commentary says this: the nature of rebellion man unfolds in the person of Cain, of a rebellious man unfolds in the person of Cain, who had an auspicious beginning as a child of hope. Remember what Eve said, but the narrative lines him up with the curse. He worked the soil, the ground. Adamah, we get Adam from that, and Adam comes out of the ground. Abel, however, seems to be lined up with man's original purpose to have dominion over life. What did God say to Adam? God said to Adam, you are supposed to care for the animals, care for nature. You're supposed to really be, in many ways, an environmentalist and take care of this creation that I made. And so Abel lines up with that a little bit better. And Cain decides that he's going to do sort of what he wants, sort of the easy thing. To have dominion over life, he kept flocks. These coincidental descriptions are enhanced with their actions in worship. So Cain decided he was going to worship the way he wanted to. It continues. Abel went out of his way to please God, which meant he had faith in God, whereas Cain was simply discharging a duty. Abel's actions were righteous, whereas Cain's were evil. These two types of people are still present. So there's a fork in the road at this point. And you will see that two types of society are developing. The society that wants to honor God, there's a society that wants to be righteous and walk with God, and there's a society that wants to shake their fist and rebel against God. And we have that. Mostly we call that evil. Mostly we call that opposing God. And there are powers, there are nations, there are people who oppose God. Now you say to yourself, well, I'm not in either of those. I'm one of those neutral people. I don't go against God. I just kind of ignore God, or I'm a decent person. If God were to look at all of my good things and my bad things, He would say, you're generally pretty good. But the standard that God has is absolute perfection, and no one can attain that. So unless we have it in Jesus Christ, there's no way that we can have that kind of perfection. The beauty is, the grace of God is that He grants that to us. He makes us flawless in so many ways when we come to a relationship with the God who created us, when we come to a relationship with Jesus Christ. And He says these two types of people are still present. Cain's lack of faith showed up in his response to God's rejection of his offering of fruit. Rather than being concerned about remedying the situation, Cain could have gone back. He had access to sheep and cattle and other things that would be an acceptable sacrifice. The situation and pleasing God, instead he was very angry about it, and his anger grew. And so when we get angry at ourselves over some situation and at God, then we tend to get depressed. Now, like I said, there are many, many other psychological, sociological reasons that people get depressed. It's not just that. There are chemical reasons. There are all kinds of things. But in this case, sometimes our actions, our negative actions, lead to that kind of depression. Verse 6 of chapter 4, Then the Lord said to Cain, Why are you angry? He confronts him. He asks him, Why is your face downcast? Why are you so depressed? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? There's the key. You just have to make a choice by faith to do what is right. But if you do not do what is right, he says, sin is crouching at the door. Now this is an illustration, almost like a tiger crouching at the door, waiting to consume a person. And he says, if you don't do what's right, this thing's going to eat you alive. And there's a spiral with anger, there's a spiral with depression, there's a spiral with negative actions, and they just keep going down and down and down. And you know that from experience, you know that from people that you've dealt with. We know it from people in recovery, that the more you go the wrong direction, the harder it is to come back from it. Its desire is to have you, but he says you must rule over it. And that's not always an easy thing, but by the grace of God, it's something that can be done. But what happened, the disregard continued, and then murder followed. First murder in human history, according to the book of Genesis. Verse 8. Now Cain said to his brother Abel, let's go out to the field. While they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother and killed Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, where is your brother Abel? Now God knew where Abel was. God knew exactly what had happened. But Cain says, I don't know, he replied. And then this classic line, am I my brother's keeper? And what's the answer to that? Always and forever, yes. Are you your brother's keeper? Are you your sister's keeper? Are you responsible? Are you there? I mean, people can make wrong choices, but you know, we are there to make an impact, to make a difference. God established this environment that we would love one another, we would care for one another, we would watch out for one another. And that's the beauty of what a church does. You people watch out for one another. You care for one another. And here was a situation where that whole denial was coming, and then a whole branch of society just said, I'm not my brother's keeper. It's not my problem. I can walk the other way. The story of the Good Samaritan is the same kind of thing. Jesus said, you know, you are responsible when you see someone in need. They become your neighbor. And a lot of the people in that story, the Good Samaritan, said, no, I'm not responsible for that. That's not my responsibility. And we do. We tend to turn the other way. Can you fix every homeless situation in the world? No. Can you fix every desperate and difficult situation? No. But if God puts someone in front of you as your neighbor to be your brother's or your sister's keeper, yes, you can do what God intends you to do in that situation. And then it adds to the curse, it begins this two-pronged way of life. Chapter 4 and verse 10. The Lord said, what have you done to Cain? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth. Now, do you remember what he said? Do you remember what God said to Adam? He said, because of the curse, Adam, now you will spend your days working the ground, and there'll be thorns and thistles, and those of you who do gardening understand that, weeds and everything too well. Now it is enhanced. Now it is compounded because it's even worse for Cain. He says, when you work the ground, it won't yield its crops for you. It'll be a struggle for you, and you'll be a restless wanderer on the earth. And so this becomes a society that, from that point on, wanders away from God. Now we're going to see a godly line. We're going to see in Adam and Eve's son Seth, in the weeks ahead, there's this godly line where Seth does honor God. And there's a whole portion of society in righteousness. But there's also a whole portion of our society that systematically turns away from God. Verse 13, Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is more than I can bear. Today you are driving me out of the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. So it's interesting because that word, wanderer, we're going to see in a moment, it comes from the word Nod. He settled east of Eden in the land of Nod, and that word Nod means the land of Nod means wanderer. So you see the Garden of Eden there on our map, and then you see there in the fertile crescent, that valley, you see the land of Nod. And so east of Eden is where Cain would settle, and he was worried that someone was going to kill him. But God, in the midst of all of that, still protects. In the midst of our waywardness and our disobedience, God is still in the habit of protecting. Verse 15, but the Lord said to him, not so. Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over. Then the Lord put a mark on Cain. Now, we don't know what this mark is. Throughout history, there have been a lot of conjecture, a lot of assumption. We have no idea what this is. It is just some identifying way that people would know from that culture that Cain was to be hands off. So then the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who found him would kill him. So Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. And that started a whole new rebellious society. Now I want to see what the New Testament says about Cain and Abel. In 1 John chapter 3, verse 11, it says this, John writes, for this is the message you have heard from the beginning. We should love one another. That's being a brother's keeper. Do not be like Cain, who belonged to the evil one and murdered his brother. Why did he murder him? Because his own actions were evil and his brothers were righteous. Now you can take this to another extreme. Do you remember what Jesus said about hate? He said, if you hate someone, it's the equivalent of murdering them. And so, you know, there are people, there are things that we hate, that we dislike. There are people that are evil. But he's saying if there's someone where you hate them without cause, then it's as though you are committing murder to that person. And so 1 John says, instead, we need to love one another. We need to follow the example of Jesus Christ, who loved us so much that he went to the cross for us so that we could have forgiveness of sins and eternal life. And then the book of Hebrews talks about the great faith. By faith, Hebrews chapter 3, verse 11, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command. That's the whole book of Genesis. That's the first couple of chapters of Genesis. So that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. In other words, God made everything that we see out of the invisible by his hand. And then he says this in Hebrews 3, by faith, Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. By faith, he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offering. And by faith, Abel still speaks, even though he is long past, even though he is dead. The whole principle here is that we have 2 ways of society, and you can see that growing. You look on the national, you look at China, you look at Korea, North Korea, you look at Iran, you look at Russia, and you look at parts of America, where there is this growing society that looks out for nothing else but itself, instead of looking out for the Christian principles and Christian values and the things that God wanted to redeem and bring back to us in Jesus Christ. He's doing that, and he's doing it in spades. He's doing it because he's changing people's lives, your life, my life. If you've never trusted Christ as your Savior, if you don't know what it's like to have that living relationship with the living God, then you need to have that tremendous hope that God can give when Jesus went to the cross. Because when he goes to the cross, he does something in your life and my life. And we're going to play a song about that. He makes you flawless. Doesn't mean you're perfect. Doesn't mean you always do the right thing. But it means he puts you in a righteous relationship with God. And when he looks at you, all he sees is your hope, your future, your righteousness. And that's something we can count on.